We are ready.
All right, great. We'll go ahead and get started. Welcome to the Grosse Pointe Historical Society's Dr. Frank Bicknell Lecture Series. This is the fifth program of the 2020-21 season. As a result of the ongoing pandemic, lectures continue to be held virtually. We appreciate your attendance. This lecture series is named in honor of Dr. Frank Bicknell, whose daughter and son-in-law created the Dr. Frank Bicknell Trust Fund to mark Dr. Bicknell's 80th birthday in 1987. I'm happy to say that Dr. Bicknell attended these programs till his passing in 1999. I'm Mike Skinner, chairperson of the Society's Bicknell Committee. The other members of the committee are Adam Hellebuck and Susan Lewandowski. Adam is this evening's moderator, handling the technical issues related to an online program. Meanwhile, the fact that we're meeting remotely has made it impossible for Susan to bring cookies and refreshments to those in attendance. We do apologize for that, and we look forward to returning to in-person programs when we reach the new normal, hopefully later this year or early in 2022. This is, Historical Society is looking forward to the construction of its new administration and collections resource building across Kirchwell from its circa 1823 Provençal Warehouse Museum. We hope you'll consider donating to the Society's capital campaign. Society also looks forward to reopening the Provençal Warehouse Museum and to resuming in-person programs such as the second Saturday open house tours and the one-room schoolhouse sessions either this fall or sometime in 2022. Now, before I introduce this evening's speakers, I'd like to describe the May Bicknell Lecture. The topic of the May 19th program is the recent Arcadia publishing book, Grand Estates of Grosse Pointe. As many of you know, each May during Preservation Month, the Historical Society co-sponsors its Bicknell Lecture with the Grosse Pointe community's greatest example of historic preservation, the Etzel and Eleanor Ford House. We are fortunate that when Mrs. Eleanor Clay Ford died in 1976, as the Detroit Free Press noted, quote, Mrs. Ford's greatest gift to the public, indeed her greatest legacy, is her home, which she has transferred to a trust with a request that it be used for the benefit of the public, unquote. With this final act of generosity, which Mrs. Ford included in her will, the home and furnishings remained intact as a window of the past, Grosse Pointe's past. During the 20th century, the early 20th century, the Grosse Pointes transitioned from a summer retreat for wealthy Detroit families to a year-round home for prominent professionals, many of whom hired the finest architects and built grand mansions. By the 1930s, massive Georgian, Tudor, and other style residences were commonplace, and the Grosse Pointes were a thriving community awash with renowned families, natural beauty, historic architecture, and grand estates. The presenter is the author of this book, The Grand Estates of Grosse Pointe, Katie Doyle. And Katie was once part of the Grosse Pointe Historical Society's plaque committee. Finally, tonight's program. Tonight's program is entitled Grosse Pointe's Real Estate Point System and Ethnic Diversity, or should I say lack thereof, in the 1960s. We're proud that this program includes an essay contest. $500 prize will be given to one student from each of the three high schools in the Grosse Pointes. And you see now on the screen the information about the program. Let me just say a little bit about that. Essays must be original work, a maximum of 750 words. They'll be judged on relevance, historic accuracy, quality and depth of research, mechanics, and organization. Essays received by May 13th will be considered. Now for the program itself this evening. In 1966, the first African-American family purchased a home in the Grosse Pointe Woods, as a matter of fact, but they had to get a straw buyer to do so. And in April of 1969, Grosse Pointe Farms defeated an open housing ordinance. Thus, despite the adoption of the federal government's U.S. Fair Housing Act in 1968, ethnic diversity came slow to the Grosse Pointe community. A point system existed in the community until about a half a century ago, and officially it was dropped in 1960, but I've talked to realtors over the years that said it was probably about 1970 before it was discontinued altogether. And you know, we normally have topics that are very, very complementary to the community. What a great community with such a stellar history, but this is one point in this history that is not stellar. But anyway, the point system included a questionnaire that was openly discriminatory. In addition to what the point system did not put in writing was the fact that individuals of Polish, Greek, and Italian or Jewish descent had to have progressively higher scores to be considered for residency, and there was no rating that would permit those of Asian or African descent to move into the community. This evening presenters are Kathy El-Messidi, author of the 1972 book, Grosse Pointe, Michigan, Race Against Race, and Doug Vrieland, author of the new book, September of 2020, The Fort, Growing Up in Grosse Pointe During the Civil Rights Movement. Kathy was born, raised, and educated in Grosse Pointe, the author of 2 historical books, the first of which was the 1972 book, Grosse Pointe, Michigan, Race Against Race, and the editor of 2 biographies. She served as a communication executive in Houston for more than 40 years. A graduate of Grosse Pointe High, now Grosse Pointe South, of course, and the University of Michigan, she earned a PhD in current American history and journalism in 1976. She began a career as a journalist at the Christian Science Monitor. Kathy went on to write speeches for senior executives at EDS, Exxon, General Motors, IBM, Information Systems Group, Rice University, Tenneco, and the University of Houston. During college, she held a summer internship at the Grosse Pointe News, where she had a front row seat to the Pointe's police blotters as the first African-American residents moved into the community. Married to Dr. Adele El-Messidi, the global petroleum engineer at Grosse Pointe's Memorial Church. She is the mother of 2 daughters, Lila and Mimi. While Kathy's book, Grosse Pointe, Michigan, Race Against Race, is out of print, Kathy is happy to announce that because it's out of print, she's gotten the rights back, and she recently added it to Kindle. Plus, John King Books has copies on the shelf in downtown Detroit, and it's available online. But the Kindle edition is available for $10. She'll talk more about that later. Our second presenter tonight is Doug Vrieland. Doug was born in Southwest Michigan. His family moved to Grosse Pointe when he was in elementary school. They joined the congregation at the Reformed Church of Detroit in Grosse Pointe Park, today known as the First Christian Reformed Church of Detroit, attending the adjacent Grosse Pointe Country Day School and then Lutheran East High in Harper Woods. His book, The Fort, Growing Up in Grosse Pointe in the Civil Rights Movement, is his first. His second, based on his time as a minister, will be published later this year. Doug possesses a BA in history from Calvin College, a Master of Divinity from Calvin Theological College, and a Doctor of Ministry from the Fuller Theological Seminary. After serving 12 years as a Christian Reformed Church pastor, Doug joined the United States Navy, serving 20 years as a chaplain. Well, that would be, his second book should be quite interesting, although not tied to Grosse Pointe history. That included a 7-year assignment in Yokosuka, Japan. During his time in the Navy, he was deployed to Iraq and responded to the 9/11 terrorist attack in New York City and the March 11th, 2010 earthquake, tsunami, and nuclear disaster in Japan. Doug and his wife reside in Holland, Michigan. Doug will be the first to speak tonight, but he will also be at the Brabanza Warehouse this Saturday because he is at home in Holland and Kathy's at home in Houston. So we don't know we'll be able to get her to come in to sign books, but he'll be at the Brabanza Warehouse this Saturday from 12 noon to 2 p.m. If you'd like to come purchase a book and have him autograph it. People that come will enter through the front door and go out through the back or the side door, side porch, and there'll be mask wearing and social distancing during this book signing. Doug will begin this evening's program after a brief description of background information. He and Kathy will describe their years in the Grosse Pointe community and how it relates to this evening's topic. There will also be a question and answer session at the end. If attendees wish to ask a question, please enter it into the chat feature, and I'll read the questions to the presenters so that they can respond. We'll turn it over to Doug now then. Doug, thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Mike, and greetings to you and to Kathy and to all those who have taken the time to attend this. I'm totally honored. I think we got 80 people here, so that's amazing. I want to start out with some background to understand the housing conditions, the housing situation, the struggle for open housing in Grosse Pointe. You have to understand Detroit, of which Grosse Pointe is certainly a part, and the history of Detroit, and open housing for African Americans. And Mike talked about this is not stellar history in Grosse Pointe, and I won't excuse anything that happened, but I think it helps us to understand better what happened and why. And so I want to begin the story on January 5, 1914. And in my view, that's probably the most significant day in all of Detroit history. On that day, a man named Henry Ford, and some of you may have heard of him, he announced that he would pay $5 a day wages to anyone who would work in his factory. Now, the going rate at the time was $2.25 a day. So he was going to pay double the going rate for factory workers. It was an economic decision. He was struggling to get workers. Immigration from Europe was drying up. He was finding that the turnover in the factories was very expensive. To train somebody and then they turned around and quit was just too expensive. So if you paid more and they stayed, that would, he felt, be economically advantageous. That was 1914. By 1918, the United States was finding itself, 1917, finding itself in World War I. And now Henry Ford's labor problems were only increased because now he had these huge government contracts and a draft pulled a lot of people out of the workforce. And so he had to get people to work in his factories. And one of the places he looked was the Deep South, particularly Alabama and Mississippi. And he went down there, he sent recruiters down there and recruited African Americans to come north and work in his factories for $5 a day. Primarily, they would work in the foundries, which were extremely hot and very miserable conditions, but they were good paying jobs. The African Americans, on the other hand, were lured by the idea of good wages and getting away from Jim Crow. And those two outweighed the horrible Michigan winters. Did it snow in Detroit today? We had snow here in Holland, so you know.
Yes, it certainly did. Yep.
Michigan winters are not something they're unique, and but these African Americans were willing to come up from Michigan, and so soon we were getting as many as 8 train loads a day from Mississippi and Alabama into Detroit, just African Americans flowing like crazy for those jobs and escaping Jim Crow. The trouble is, white people also wanted those jobs. And white Southerners, particularly from the Appalachian states, Kentucky, Tennessee, and West Virginia, also started to come into Detroit, also wanted to have those jobs, and brought with them a Jim Crow mentality. Now we have this problem of this whole concept of white Southerners. Charles LeDuff writes these words in his book, Detroit, an American Autopsy. He writes, Michigan may geographically be one of America's most northern states, but spiritually it is one of its most southern. And I think that's a very, very insightful thing. Kevin Boyle writes that the white Southerners believe that African Americans degrade neighborhoods, making them less clean, less safe, less desirable, and less valuable. Less valuable. Property values. You're going to hear that over and over and over again in this presentation, keeping property values high. And the idea was African Americans reduce the value of property. So we have what's now known as this great migration of African Americans north to the industrial cities of Erie, Pennsylvania, Cleveland, Milwaukee, Chicago, the smaller cities, Akron, Grand Rapids. But Detroit was the primary place with those $5 a day wages. And prior to this, African Americans could live anywhere in the city. Most of them lived in a former Jewish neighborhood known as Black Bottom, but there were white people in Black Bottom. There were African Americans in neighborhoods like Poletown, which is predominantly Polish, neighborhoods like Corktown that was predominantly Irish. So the African Americans were spread throughout the community. Once these Southerner whites arrive, suddenly they are forced to stay in Black Bottom. Now, the Supreme Court ruled in 1917 in a case called Buchanan versus Worley that city governments could not enforce segregation laws. So that's 1917. So now these Southerners can no longer keep blacks in separate communities by law the way they did in the South. So they came up with new ways to enforce segregation. One was violence. And a very interesting case, a very interesting historical situation is the Sweet case. I don't know how many of you are familiar with that. 1924 to 1925. Olson Sweet moved into a house on Garland Street, the corner of Charlevoix and Garland. That's now a historic landmark. And thousands of white people came, surrounded his house. A shot came out from his house. A white person was killed. And Clarence Darrow of the Scopes trial, just off of that, came to Detroit and defended and got the Sweets off in that case. But violence, that's an illustration of violence, using violence to keep Black people in their place and not let them move into white neighborhoods. The other way was restrictive deeds or covenants. So everybody in the neighborhood would get together and here are the rules for this neighborhood. Here are the stipulations. No commercial activity, no multi-resident homes. You can't divide single homes into rental units, and especially no selling of homes to racial or ethnic minority groups. And so by about 1940, about 80% of the neighborhoods in Detroit outside of the Grand Boulevard, 80% of the neighborhoods were covered by these restrictive racial covenants. The real estate agents also played a role in this. In 1924, the National Association of Real Estate Boards adopted a code of ethics. And here's their code of ethics, and I quote, "A realtor should never be instrumental in introducing into a neighborhood members of any race or nationality whose presence will clearly be detrimental to property values in the neighborhood." So it's now unethical for a real estate agent to sell a home in a neighborhood to somebody that's considered less desirable ethnically. And so it's the real estate boards, as well as restrictive deeds, as well as violence, that enforced segregation in Detroit in the middle part of the 20th century. That's all background. And so to understand Grosse Pointe, I think you need to understand all of that. And now I want to turn it over to Kathy, and she's going to tell us more about the specific restrictions in Grosse Pointe.
Thank you. Thanks, Doug. And thanks to Mike and Adam for supporting us as we do this, and to Lisa Gandolo for recommending that we have this topic. I'd like to start out a little bit talking about how I got interested in this. I was asked by a good friend, editor of our Tower newspaper in Grosse Pointe High, one summer when we were both in college, if I wanted to take over his normal spot on the Grosse Pointe News. And so I did. It was a summer internship, and Bob Edgar actually hired me to that position. And so I was doing obituaries. I learned how to write up weddings. I learned all the stories about Grosse Pointe and how people lived there. I was surprised when the regular reporter for the police beats said he was going on vacation and he wanted me to take over everything he was doing. So I just happened to be on the Grosse Pointe Woods police beat when the first African-American family, Gordon Wright and his family, moved in 1966. And he moved in and met kind of a mixed picture of hostility and hospitality. Some of it from within the community, some of it from outside of the community. People ran over his lawn with their cars. People destroyed his mailbox. Other people brought him lemonade. Other people came over and visited with him and welcomed him. The police at the same time were writing everything down on the police blotter, and they were taking note of every car that came around more than twice. And they found that there were as many people from inside the community as outside that were creating this sort of a traffic jam around his house. I went back to Bob Edgar, the editor, and asked him, I said, gee, I've got this whole big list of all these things that were going on over there. And I think we should write this up. This is news. This is the first African-American family to move into Grosse Pointe. He said, oh no, he said, he had a long cigarette holder. I can remember looking at that cigarette holder. He said, no, we're not going to do that. We've agreed with the Detroit news media, all of them, TV, papers and all, we're not going to cover it. So I said, oh, not even a pointer of interest. This man is very fascinating. He's the son of a Cleveland real estate millionaire. He's got a yacht. He wants his children to be college educated like he was. He wants good schools. So he said no. And then, of course, the Detroit media sensationalized it, missed a lot of the really good information about this. And so I decided to keep my notes and interview people who were involved in different aspects of racial relations in the community. Now, both Mike and Doug have talked about these restrictive covenants. And I'd like to kind of start by reading you what happened in Grosse Pointe with their very specific restrictive covenants. The Grosse Pointe Property Owners Association, which was founded in 1934, by 1945, had secured this set of screening tools, I guess you'd call them, for people who were looking at homes. It was really a clandestine list. Nobody that was looking for houses knew about it. And the strange part of it is, this is right after around the end of World War II, where African Americans were vital to the war effort. And yet you see this kind of restrictive questioning. I want to read the ones that Grosse Pointe was established on. And these are not my words. These are actually the words of the point system. If not American born, how long have they lived in the country? Is their way of living typically American? Whatever that was. Are the husband's immediate associates typical? Are their friends predominantly typical? Appearances, swarthy, slightly swarthy, or not at all? Accents, pronounced, medium, slight, or not at all? What is the husband's position as opposed to his occupation? And how does this position stand in the public's opinion? Is the dress neat, sloppy, flashy, or conservative? And for you students, they even asked grammar, good, fair, or poor, okay? And Mike mentioned that there was a different category of required points for people of different ethnicities, and there were no points given to Blacks, Asians, excuse me, or Latinos. One wonders how the realtors actually knew this much about people that came through the community looking for houses. So by 1960, as we mentioned, there were a lot of national civil rights acts, and the point system was made public and questioned. The Human Rights Council of Grosse Pointe marched for open housing, and in 1964, Michigan actually established a civil rights commission and made it mandatory to investigate any claims of discrimination under the state constitution. In April of 1966, just before Gordon Wright and his family moved in, the Grosse Pointe ministers and the Unitarian Church produced statements that promoted open housing. I think Doug's going to talk about that. And the Open Housing Committee was formed to actually promote more proactive steps than the Grosse Pointe Human Rights Council was forwarding at the time. So let's talk a little bit about the people who were part of this, I want to call it drama, when the first African-American family moved in. Let's go to Gordon Wright. He was, as I mentioned, the son of a Cleveland real estate millionaire, and LBJ, the president, was appointed him head of the U.S. Commerce Department's Economic Development Committee administration. He had actually previously lived in all-white suburbs of Cleveland. He had wanted good schools, a yacht club membership, a new home for his wife and kids. And he was only in his late 30s. He was a young man. He tried initially to find a home by going into Grosse Pointe and seeing realtors. One realtor didn't call back. Another wanted to see him in person before they actually showed him houses. So he kind of gave up on the realtors. And well, he actually finally asked a realtor, would it be a problem for you if I looked for houses? And the realtor told him that it would be a problem if she actually sold him a house. He said, I didn't have time to be a test case in this situation. So he enlisted a straw buyer, John Fillion, who was a Grosse Pointe lawyer. As I mentioned, they had a mixed reception once they moved in. There were threats to their property. A bus full of students stopped and made faces and so on. People stopped and some people and yelled the N-word. But others were equally hospitable to them. The Open Housing Committee members actually stayed with him during this time. When I interviewed him, he said he didn't want to rehash his experience in Grosse Pointe, but with a sense of pride, he said, my father can buy and sell that whole place out there. So I think he had kind of a mixed reaction to being the first African-American resident. Not long after, maybe about a week later, Glenn Brown, who was an associate of Gordon Wright's at the Commerce Department, moved into a rental property in Grosse Pointe Park. He had some trepidation after hearing about Gordon Wright's experience, but he fended off the media. He didn't have any problem with his neighbors. He had very peaceful entry, and he had a very good experience, actually. And he was the kind of person that was more inclined to neighborliness, I think. he wasn't looking for a place for his yacht. He became the leader of an Indian guides group. He was active in the PTO. He became an active church member. And he also was quite active in the Grosse Pointe civil rights groups. He said of his experience in Grosse Pointe, I understand the people there, and I feel that they understand me. So he said he had experienced friends, fun, and very, very little friction. Both Gordon Wright and Glenn Brown were reassigned to different jobs and had to move from the community. So, but they ended up having two very different experiences. Then there was Bill Tucker, who doesn't get very much, didn't get any press at all when he moved in. He was a manager at Jacobson's, if some of you remember Jacobson's department store. He had a lot of association with white people before he moved into Grosse Pointe. In fact, all three of these people, of these African Americans did. But he had problems with the realtors who said they were not taking singles when they saw him. But when the members of the open housing committee called inquiring about the same house, they did say they were taking singles. So I can't say that the end of the point system was completely in place by the time the first African Americans moved in. So in retrospect, Bill Tucker said he really enjoyed the physical amenities of Grosse Pointe, but he didn't find any sense of neighborliness. So he missed being a true neighbor. So let's talk a little bit about the people who were trying, the white people in Grosse Pointe that were trying so hard to help aid and abet and make easy open housing. As I mentioned, it was an offshoot. The Open Housing Committee was an offshoot of the Human Relations Council. Sally Brown, I interviewed her. She was president. And she said they did a lot of different things to try to encourage open housing in Grosse Pointe. They distributed pledge cards in churches and high schools. 95% of the students in Grosse Pointe High School signed the pledge card that said, we who live in Grosse Pointe believe that any family should be free to choose its place of residence. We welcome neighbors on a personal basis without regard to race, creed, or country of origin. The Grosse Pointe Committee on Open Housing also gave, as we've seen, quiet assistance to some of these Black home shoppers in Grosse Pointe. They also sought a local ordinance that reaffirmed Michigan's legally insured open housing. However, Grosse Pointe Farms, which put forward an ordinance, voted unfavorably, 57% to 43% on the ordinance for open housing. It didn't change the state or the federal laws, but it certainly didn't affirm that Grosse Pointe was ready for open housing. The committee, interestingly enough, I'm not sure everybody knew this, had an agreement with the Detroit Negro Cotillion Club to provide escorts to any professional club members who wanted to consider Grosse Pointe houses. The Cotillion members, I think, were really well-to-do African Americans. I interviewed Herman Glass, who was a Cotillion leader, and he also served as an advisor to the Grosse Pointe Open Housing Committee from 1968 to 1970. He kind of had a little bit of a discouragement to offer. He got tired of nothing happening, and he advised Grosse Pointers, if you want something to integrate, buy some houses and sell them to minority group members. He said the suburbs want an instant Negro who will move in and erase their sins. This is tokenism but it must start somewhere. And he had more confidence in young people than he did in the adults. Now let's see how the second to last element, the realtors, how did they weigh in? As as Doug mentioned, they were convinced that there was a universal law that if an African American moved into Grosse Pointe, the property values would immediately plummet. And so, but also they also claimed they were going to really follow the laws. They couldn't do anything but obey the state and federal laws. Orville Sherwood, I interviewed. He was a realtor active in the Grosse Pointe Property Association, both before and after the point system was revealed. Said, we have to show these properties, and we are doing so. It's forced housing, he said, not open housing. But that's an unpopular argument. He really was worried about realtors being accused in court of discriminating, because he said they have to obey the state laws, and yet they're agents of a buyer who might or might not want to sell their home to an African American. So he pointed out that there was a conflict created by the law. You have to show property to people your clients don't want to sell to, he said. I also, interestingly, interviewed the son of my boss at the Grosse Pointe News. He was also called Robert Edgar, better known as Butch Edgar by the community. He was a realtor, and he claimed also that he claimed that minorities depress property values. And I pointed out that Gordon Wright had sold his home eventually, and a white person bought it for more than he had paid for it originally. And Mr. Edgar said, well, that's because it was a seller's market. I found that a little amusing. But Robert Edgar said the do-gooder organizations want to move in more than the Negro wants the Negro to move in more than the Negro wants to move in himself. He had an interesting comment on the use of the Constitution. I had to study a little bit harder because I'm kind of an American history interests me. He said the Constitution not only gives people the right of association, but also we've got the Third Amendment. Does anybody know what the Third Amendment is? It's that one about quartering soldiers. And it literally states, no soldier shall in time of peace be quartered in any house without the consent of the owner, nor in time of war, but in a manner to be prescribed by law. Now that was his way of saying Grosse Pointers, who are all at this point white, have no obligation to have outsiders move in to their homes. So it was kind of a stretch, but that's as far as I see. And absolutely no Supreme Court ruling has ever been done about the Third Amendment. There was another person who had a totally different take, a Grosse Pointer, who had a totally different take on the Constitution, which I found interesting. Her name was Martha Wiley. She was the wife of a Chrysler executive and a very strong participant in Republican politics. She was a lawyer and on the appointed to the Michigan Human Rights Commission. Her take on the Constitution was that it gives people of all kinds the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of property. It's guaranteed. And then I asked her, and I think this is interesting in respect to what Grosse Pointe Farms did in not passing the ordinance for open housing. I asked her why it would be even necessary or advisable for a local ordinance to be put forward. And she said most communities prefer local enforcement of laws. Also, it's typically quicker to enforce them because of the large state caseloads. Finally, there were criminal penalties in that Grosse Pointe ordinance that are more effective than the civil penalties in the state and federal ordinances. She also said passing the ordinance would send clear signals that that Grosse Pointe is not resisting minority group residents. So let's, to kind of summarize here, I know I've talked a lot about the different participants in the drama of the first person being coming into the community, a person of color, buying a home in the community. The summary really is that the laws didn't really make integration possible, nor did they prevent it. In other words, the Grosse Pointe ordinance didn't prevent it, but they did send a signal. And it sent a signal that Gordon Wright, who was trained as a lawyer at UCLA, he was a member of the Ohio Bar and a recognized specialist in real estate law. He knew those Michigan laws, but he didn't have time or the inclination to call on them. So what did he do? He used a straw buyer. He depended on the people who were positive about this possible development. So what allowed the progress was really that whites and blacks took some really bold steps, if you think about it. Enough Grosse Pointe residents saw value for the community and the young people in that community in opening it up to a more diverse cross-section of residents. Some Black people had gained greater financial means and career success to actually afford Grosse Pointe. And they also summoned the desire, sense of purpose and confidence in the potential for interracial relations to buy or rent there. Today, about 3 to 5% of the people in Grosse Pointe are African American. About 8% are considered non-white. That means 92% are white. And that's much different than it was in the late 1960s. The property values have not declined at all. And nor has there been tremendous white flight. So the question remains, does Grosse Pointe now represent an exclusive version of a very diverse community? Glenn Brown, I go back to him, valued not only the amenities in Grosse Pointe and the potential for bettering Grosse Pointe and similar communities. But he hit the nail on the head when he contended that in a modern world of extremely close communications, no city, section, or community can afford keeping out people they fear or do not understand. So Grosse Pointe at this point was really in the 60s, a community with in a two-legged race. One-legged was going one direction, kind of backwards or trying to not make progress in terms of racial integration. The legs were pulling in different directions. So it made progress in any direction difficult. So one of the things that we really haven't agreed on in terms of housing and integration is, when will we know that we have really succeeded in successfully integrating a community like Grosse Pointe? Is the ideal solution to have 12 or 13%, which is the proportion of Blacks that are in Michigan or in the US? Is the goal just to have all the very most wealthy and prosperous Blacks who could enrich the community reputation and improve it as much as any whites could? Or is it to have a wealthy community of Blacks in the Detroit area that white people would aspire to live in, but would be excluded from? I don't think we really know what our end goal is. So, I mean, I haven't kept up, I haven't lived in Grosse Pointe for many years now. But I studied what Grosse Pointe was like in the late 60s in this one little slice of time. I'm not sure I've caught up with what's going on there or what the future might hold. But I also in my book study how race relations in Grosse Pointe and Detroit related in education. I studied students and teachers in Grosse Pointe High and Guppus at the time, as well as in religious spheres. I believe that there's still one person listening to this that was in my book. I'd like to call him out and thank him for being there back 50 years ago. John Urso and his lovely wife, Gail, have been very active in the community. They've lived in Grosse Pointe. They helped found the Grosse Pointe Interfaith Council, and they still are, they're on the Grosse Pointe Harper Woods NAACP. There really are quite a few people, contrary to the feeling maybe that Grosse Pointe has a bad reputation. There really are a lot of good people in Grosse Pointe in the sense that they have wanted to be neighbors. They've wanted to have good neighbors. They've wanted to have good relationships with people of many walks of life. So with that, I'd like to just briefly mention that my book under my married name, Kathy El-Messidi, is on Kindle, and for $10 you can find a lot of the historical things. I have a kind of a program of what happened historically for those students who are writing the essays. And now I'll turn it over to Doug, who's going to talk about the religious aspects of life in Grosse Pointe and race relations.
Well, thank you, Kathy. And we started off sort of broad with the city of Detroit. We've moved into a more narrow Grosse Pointe. My book gets even more narrow with one particular religious community, the First Christian Reformed Church of Detroit, which is located on Maryland Street, Maryland and Goethe in Grosse Pointe Park. Located 1 block from Detroit, from Mack, 2 blocks from Detroit and Alter, right in the dead corner of Grosse Pointe Park. And I wrote the book because I see, for a number of reasons, but a major one, many of the things that were going on in the 1960s when I was growing up are sort of cycled around, and we have them going on again today. And the tensions between people of goodwill, who see things differently and have to sort of sort out what is right and what is wrong, what they believe in. And this is seen especially in churches. And as a pastor, that's of course one of my big concerns and big interests. And so as I reflected on this and I reflected on my journey through Grosse Pointe, I realized that I just was blessed with a very interesting journey. It began on February 18 of 1966. My family moves to Grosse Pointe Woods from Western Michigan. And because we were Dutch Americans and affiliated for several generations with something called the Christian Reformed denomination, a denomination predominantly of Dutch people, there was no question. We're going to go to the Christian Reformed Church in Grosse Pointe Park, located on Maryland Street. Not only that, but the church ran a Christian school, which was predominantly students from the church. And so my parents enrolled me into the Christian school, which was located directly behind behind the church. Now, the church was certainly a conservative congregation. I think today we would call it evangelical. Mostly Dutch Americans, mostly from Grand Rapids, some direct immigrants from the Netherlands. And they met in this huge neo-Gothic structure. It's still there. It's on the Michigan Historic Landmark site. Huge structure with this big belfry on the corner, in the corner of Grosse Pointe. And when we moved there, I think it was my family's desire, and certainly my father's desire, that going into this church would keep us safe from sort of the big city of Detroit. And so the whole idea was, you know, we are sort of our own little enclave, that we keep our traditions alive, train our kids in the way that we were always trained, and really quite conservative. But the church was divided. There were those who sort of had that fortress mentality, but there were also those who were looking broader and looking at the community around them. And this would create the tensions in the church that, and eventually tensions in my soul that have sort of formed my life and formed my ministry. So we moved in, and the pastor was a man named Reverend John Grunewald. Old school. He had the old school sermons. They didn't have to be interesting. They just had to be doctrinally sound. And he did things the old-fashioned way. And some of the people were happy. Others were not so happy. They wanted to move ahead. At the time, there were 20 churches. In 1966, there were 20 churches in the Grosse Pointes. That includes 4 Roman Catholic parishes. 1 month after my family moved in, 26 pastors representing all but 2 of those churches, 18 churches, 26 pastors, signed a joint statement, a ministerial statement that was printed in the Grosse Pointe News. And I was going to read it, but I think we're running a little tight on time. But essentially, it said that open housing was a moral issue, that the denominations that we were a part of have all emphasized and taken a stand that regarding race relations and equal rights, and we call the community to open up towards open housing as a sort of a moral requirement. And John Grunewald signed that statement, which for a conservative Christian Reformed pastor in the day, old school, to sign something that was so socially concerned versus sort of the spiritual care for the soul, he was on the edge of, I suspect, his comfort zone. Well, that was 1 month after we moved. A couple of months later, Pastor Grunewald took an assignment to another church, and on Sunday, July 2, 1967, our church got a new pastor, Reverend Frank Steen. Reverend Steen was the exact opposite of Reverend Grunewald. He was new school, he was open-minded, he was community-focused, and he was a blast. He got his doctorate and while he was there, and so he was now Dr. Frank Steen, and us kids couldn't help that, but he was Dr. Frankenstein. And that he just had that kind of relationship he loved everybody. He had a brilliant mind and a heart that was just as big. Well, he's installed on July 2, 1967. 3 weeks later, July 23, there was a certain unpleasantness that happened in Detroit. Some people call it a rebellion, some people call it a riot. You all know what I'm talking about. Lasted for a full week. Welcome to Detroit, 3 weeks after your installation. What's interesting is 3 days before Dr. Steen was installed, the board of the Christian school met June 29, and they received a letter from a church that the Christian Reformed Church was sponsoring, was supporting, a church on Pingree and 14th Street, 6 blocks from the beginning where the riots began. And this letter from a predominantly African-American church had a request: could we send our children to the Christian school in Grosse Pointe? 1967. You can imagine, with everything Kathy's talked about, this was going to be interesting. The head of the board read it to the board and assigned two committees, the education committee, on which my dad was a part of, to interview the teachers to see how they felt about it. The teachers said, oh, we don't think that'll ever happen, but we're open to it. And the finance committee, this is a tuition-based school, how in the world are we going to support this? Okay. And they were to report back in the next meeting. The next meeting didn't happen because of the riots. Reverend Steen was deeply concerned about the riots and about the impact on the community, and really felt that the church had to do something positive to promote good race relations. And as he reflected on it, and he's just taking charge of a brand new congregation, he decided the best thing that this Christian Reformed Church could possibly do was integrate the Christian school. And so he put his weight behind it, although he's a very soft-spoken, behind-the-scenes guy. He really was, he's very smooth in many ways, but he was all for it. And so the board met again in August. They met for 10 months throughout the rest of 67 and into 1968. March of 1968, Dr. King comes. He speaks in Grosse Pointe High School. Reverend Steen and a number of members from the First Church were at that lecture. I did not have the privilege of going. I was frankly too young and from a family that wasn't interested in that sort of thing. But I was gifted that Dr. Steen was so moved by Dr. King that he brought Dr. King's perspective into the pulpit of the First Church, which deeply moved me as an adolescent growing up in this environment. A month later, Dr. King is assassinated in Memphis in April. The Christian school teachers have been preparing us students now for the potential of integrating the Christian school. So we've been looking at race issues extensively, and I think from a very solid perspective, and a Christian perspective, I would say biblical perspective, and so we grieved together in the Christian school the loss of Dr. King. And I recall sitting during the school day and watching the funeral of Dr. King, and actually crying, knowing that this was such a deeply, deeply troubling situation going on in our country, and of course in our city as well. That was April. In May, the board of the school met for the final time to discuss integrating the school. They had a 2.5 hour, according to the minutes, a 2.5 hour discussion in which they said, which according to the minutes, every board member was given ample time to express his feelings on the matter. They took a secret ballot vote. Should we admit the children from the church into the Christian Reform, into this school? They were not identified as African-American students. They were identified as church children. Should we attend these church children, allow these church children to attend the school? The results were unanimous, 100% yes, we must do that. It was considered a religious necessity requirement, living faithfully to our convictions and beliefs. We have to allow children of all color to attend our school, no matter what that means. And so in September, well, first of all, my father was tasked as the secretary of the board to write a letter to the mayor of Grosse Pointe Park. I've not been able to track that letter down. I'd love to see it. But telling the mayor this is going to be happening. And in September, a rusty bus with 12 little black kids makes the turn off of Mack Avenue onto Maryland Street into Grosse Pointe and lets off these little kids as students in the Dutch Christian school behind the Christian Reformed Church. It's really kind of an amazing thing. For the most part, the community ignored our school, but there was some violence that resulted in that. People started gathering at the corner of Mack in Maryland and throwing rocks at the bus. One day, a rock actually broke the window of the bus and literally just traumatized these precious children who are heading to school. And our teachers helped us work through that. And that experience put in a very deep passion in me for racial justice, racial equality, and racial harmony. It really formed me in who I am in so many ways. The point I want to make in all of this is that it was the churches that took the lead. I'm not seeing that as much today, but it was the churches that were the moral conscience of the community. The pastors could say, this isn't right, and they got a hearing. Now, Grosse Pointe Farms didn't vote through, but certainly the pastors were willing to take a stand. Pastor Steen got behind and said, we have to do this. There was a sort of a leadership that the churches were giving. And by giving that leadership, they gained a certain authority, a certain credibility to speak on these matters and so forth. If you were to go down Maryland Street in Grosse Pointe Park today, you would see on the corner of Goethe, First Christian Reformed Church of Detroit. It's still there. The members are no longer predominantly Dutch Americans. They reflect the diversity of Grosse Pointe, and especially the Cabbage Patch neighborhood of Grosse Pointe Park, which is one of the more diverse parts of Grosse Pointe. The Christian school is not there anymore. It closed in 2004. High costs in charter schools put them out of business, but the church now runs a preschool. It's called God's Kids. If you were to go there during recess time, it's just a wonderful experience. Especially a couple of years ago, it's more so than the more recent years, but you see the United Nations of kids out there. I mean, you see little Asian kids and Black kids and white kids and Hispanic kids, and they're all just sort of intermingling, and it's just a very beautiful, beautiful sight. The Christian Reformed Church currently works with all of the churches in Grosse Pointe. All of the churches in Grosse Pointe continue to be concerned about housing issues. And the Christian Reformed Church has taken a strong lead in this. There's a joint project funded by the Grosse Pointe churches, but also with Habitat for Humanity. If you cross Mack from Grosse Pointe on Maryland Street and go about 3 blocks, you're going to find a whole neighborhood of 1,500 square foot aluminum siding houses, 2-stall attached garages, beautiful, well-kept lawns right there in Detroit, as beautiful as anything you're going to find in the suburbs. And this is just one of the things that the churches continue to do in order to be involved in the community and in order to better the community around them. And so that's what my book is about. If you're interested in it, again, I'm going to be at the Historic Society on Saturday from noon to 2. Come on by. I'd love to talk with you. And book's $20. Give me a $20 bill. You get a book, no tax, none of that business, and I'll sign it for you. Or you can get my signature for $20 and I'll give you a book free. You can do it either way, whatever you like. So I think with that, I'm finished. And is it time for some
Very
questions?
good. All right, good. I just had one thing to add in particular for the students. On the gphistorical.org, the Grosse Pointe Historical Society's website, is the entire text of Dr. King's March 14th, 1968 speech at Grosse Pointe High, of course, now Grosse Pointe South. There's also photographs and a short audio section. I'd also, and beyond the students, but in particular the students, if you're interested in learning more, I'd also suggest that reviewing Dr. King's June 23rd, 1963 speech at Detroit's Cobo Arena, part of the TCF Center now. This event was the first time that Dr. King delivered his I Have a Dream speech that became so famous 2 months later after the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom on August 28th, 1963. And that speech included the following: I have a dream this afternoon that my 4 children will not come up in the same young days that I came up within. They will be judged by the content of their character, not the color of their skin. I have dreamed this afternoon that one day right here in Detroit, Negroes will be able to buy a house or rent a home anywhere that their money will carry them. Hard to believe that this was all going on 50 years ago when I was growing up. That questionnaire is available in Kathy's book. It's also available online. And I wonder how they would have dealt with everyone in casual dress today. Kathy, well, by the way, we first met with Kathy, Adam and Sue from the committee and myself in January, and we started talking about how the Grosse Pointes had changed. I noticed in the chat, someone commented that some of the Grosse Pointes are over the 3 to 5% that Kathy mentioned. Grosse Pointe Park is over 10% African American. And Adam and Sue and I assured Kathy, who's lived in Houston for 40 years, but has visited Grosse Pointe periodically, Doug, who's lived all over the world and hasn't been in the Grosse Pointes, at least as a resident since high school, some 40 years ago, the things had changed. Population was becoming more diverse. And then what happened? The KKK flag incident hit the news. So we still have a long way to go. And I'll mention something that an African-American friend who moved into Grosse Pointe Woods 13 years ago told us recently. A week after she moved in, she was pulling weeds and a neighbor came up and asked if the owners of the house were at home. And she said people in that neighborhood still do not talk to her today. Adam will be adding, for those of you who found this as interesting as I did, Adam is in the process of adding dozens of our old programs onto a YouTube channel, but he'll be putting this program up this coming week. And Adam pointed out to me why a lot of students weren't here tonight, because if it's put up on the YouTube channel, they can watch it at 1.5 speed and watch it in 45 minutes instead of an hour or less, and still get their possibly qualify for the $500. So we've got a number of quotes of chats, comments, and in Q&A. I'd like to mention a few. Kathy, your biggest fans, the Rettenbachs are here. Jan Zuniga said amazing. And then another person, actually Gail Urso, or her husband, I'm sorry, but it's Gail's email, said the ratio of people of color varies greatly in the Grosse Pointes, depending on which one you're speaking of. And we've just talked about Grosse Pointe Park. And they asked for your email address. I hope it was all right, but I've already given both out. And so I think we're good there. The titles of the books are Grosse Pointe Michigan, Race Against Race, that's Kathy's 1972 book. And Doug's 2020 book is The Fort Growing Up in Grosse Pointe During the Civil Rights Movement. I think that covers, yep, that pretty much covers the chat. We've got some questions on the question and answer section. Joan Richardson asked how many people of color tried to buy homes in the Grosse Pointes and were denied because of the point system. Did any of them sue when they were rejected? Did every home in the Grosse Pointes include a covenant? How do I learn whether my home had such a covenant? We have a number of real estate deeds and titles, and you can read right, if you've got the entire history of the house, you can actually see where it tells you if it kept things out. And we also have a complete collection of the Grosse Pointe News, and it's amazing to read in the 1940s where they would actually put in housing ads that no African Americans or blacks or Negroes, as they said then, need apply. But let's go back to Kathy for a moment. How many people of color tried to buy homes in the Grosse Pointes were denied because of the point system? I don't know if that's possible. And then do you know if any of them sued when they were rejected, Kathy?
I don't know of any that sued. And part of the problem with suing was that if you lost the case, you had to pay all the court costs. So some of the people that were trying, they had a certain budget for their home. They were moving into Grosse Pointe, and whether they had a complaint because they were whites and discriminated against because they were Polish or Greek or whatever, or whether they were blacks, they didn't want to have to pay those costs to put forth a case that they might lose. So that I know of no people that actually brought a case against the point system in Grosse Pointe. But mind you, there were covenants like this. Grosse Pointe is not the only community in Michigan or in the US. Between 1948 and 1958, there were quite a few communities throughout the US that had such covenants. And I don't know whether they would have challenged some of the laws as they came, the civil rights laws as they came on board in other communities as well.
Great, thank you.
If I can speak to that a minute.
Please, Doug, please.
I don't know that Grosse Pointe ever had covenants. It may have, but I'm not aware of that. That was a Detroit thing. Grosse Pointe had the point system, and this was all very much under the table, very hidden. So you would not know. And Kathy mentioned, how did the realtors know this stuff? They actually hired private investigators.
That I didn't know.
And so it was private, you come in and they would hire a private investigator and check out, all of these questions for you. And so I am not sure, I'm not aware of racial covenants in Grosse Pointe itself.
Great. Here's another question from Ned McGrath. Was there any intervention from civil rights leaders in Detroit or elsewhere in southeastern Michigan during these struggles? Either one of you know?
Well, Doug mentioned, the Martin Luther King coming and speaking, but which is also covered in my book. And Mark Rentenbach was the head of the student council when that happened. He was in charge of that for the students. The thing that I did was I went into Detroit and talked to the Detroit Ministerial Association, and they were kind of the ministers, even in Detroit, among the Black community, were always the leaders. I mean, we're often the leaders at that time. And their comment to me was, Grosse Pointe should go and settle, stay by itself and settle its own white racism. We don't need to come in and do anything. So they were very much kind of mind your own business, take care of your own racism. And, you know, we're not going to come in and preach to you or whatever. So that was kind of an interesting, and to me at my young age at that time was kind of surprising. You know, I thought they'd want to come and scold us or something, you know, but no, they had a different way of thinking about it.
Great. Doug,
Regarding,
anything there?
yeah, regarding civil rights leaders, I suspect it depends how you define a civil rights leader. In 1960, was it 1963 that Dr. King had the march down Woodward Avenue, 63,
Yes.
64?
That's what he spoke at Cobo that I was talking about a moment ago. Yeah.
64. Was that 63 or 60?
63, yes. Yep, yep. June of 63.
That happened on a Sunday. And the governor of Michigan at the time was a man named George Romney. And George Romney was a very devout Mormon. And he had a policy, he would do no politicizing, no political activities on Sunday. What's interesting is there was a smaller march the following Saturday in Grosse Pointe, down Kirchville Avenue. And Governor Romney showed up for that particular march because it was on a Saturday. And so I think there's some leadership there. The other person I would mention is a man named John Fikens. John Fikens was nominated, he was a judge, nominated for federal bench by Nixon, but not confirmed. So he took a job as the head of the Michigan Civil Rights Commission. He was a Republican. When Gordon Wright moved into Grosse Pointe, and all of this stuff was going on, Fikens and the Civil Rights Commission sent a letter to everybody in Grosse Pointe about it, and then called a meeting at the public library in order to sort of help people work through their anxiety and answer their questions. The interesting thing about that is John Fikens was a member of the Christian Reformed Church. And so although we have this conservative church, we also have members that were very, very passionate about civil rights. I also neglected to say another member of that church, a man named Jack Nineheis, was the landlord for Bill Tucker. Bill Tucker did not buy, he rented.
Yeah.
And they could not find a place, landlords would not rent to him. Jack Nineheis had moved off of Lake Point over to Buckingham and had a house on Lake Point just around the corner from just a block away from the church. And he rented to Bill Tucker. And so you have these sort of traditional people that are afraid and want to just pull in. And then you have people are wanting to push out. And my book is about a father that wanted to pull in and a pastor that wanted to push out, and the tension that comes to a junior high kid, namely me. So yes, I think there was some very good leadership, not necessarily nationally known names.
By the way, Mr. Nyhouse is with us tonight, that rented that home on Lake Point. We're going to come to a question from him in a moment. How did housing in Grosse Pointe compare to that in Detroit during the 1960s and the 1967 insurrection or riot? How did it impact all of this? Kathy, you graduated, if you don't mind me saying, in the class of 63. You were off to Michigan. You were off to U of M, though, weren't you?
I graduated from Michigan in 67, but I had I was married previously, and I had my first engagement party during the riots. So I was there.
You were in Grosse Pointe then, okay.
Yeah, I was in Grosse Pointe. And how did it impact what was happening? I think it scared people in the community. I think that was something that they related to when they when the realtors or people talk to me about people wanting to live in a safe community, they brought that up. I think it was a factor also that made people think we've got to do something about this. So it also inspired some people to say, we've got to look at the race problem. We've got to solve it. We've got to be better neighbors maybe. So I think it went in two directions again, the two-legged race that seems to be common in the US, not just in Grosse Pointe, but people of two different thoughts trying to make progress on something. So.
Great. Here's a comment from Paula. I am Polish and Sicilian Italian, and we were not well received in 1968 till my brother became the scholar quarterback in athletics at Grosse Pointe North. Very good. Thank you. Good point. That's how a lot of things change. And covenants are contained in deeds, and the Supreme Court outlawed them later on. The goal of the Grosse Pointe, and this is from, I'm sorry, let me page down. This is from Gail Urso, or Mr. Urso, possibly. The goal of the Grosse Pointe Interfaith Center was not to integrate Grosse Pointe, but to prepare our kids in Grosse Pointe to live in a multiracial, multicultural world. It seemed presumptuous to assume that Black people would want to live in Grosse Pointe. Thank you. Were there Catholic churches? Where were the Catholic churches on this? Doug, you mentioned out of the 28 or 30 churches, why don't you tell us that statement again about how many voted for this?
Well, a couple of things. Yes, there were, I believe, 20 churches in Grosse Pointe, including 4 Catholic parishes. The Ministerial Association, by the way, the Catholic priests were not a part of the Ministerial Association. Why that is, but I don't know. But they did all sign the statement for open housing. The other thing I think that's significant, and those of you from Grosse Pointe know the parishes probably better than I do, but the one that serves in Grosse Pointe Woods serves the area where, is that Star of the Sea or?
Our Lady Star of the Sea is in the woods, and then one block into St. Clair Shore is Joan of Arc, St. Joan of Arc. So
I think it was Star of the Sea. Is that on Mac?
No, that's Joan of Arc, one block into St. Clair Shores.
Okay.
The Star of the Sea is where Weber Place comes up off of Lake Shore and turns. It's just up from there. I was at a funeral this morning there. As a matter of fact.
I think it was Star of the Sea. I mentioned that John Fikens.
Morningside, on Morningside Street. That's right. Thank you.
I mentioned that John Fikens had written a letter to all of the people in Grosse Pointe. And either that letter or a different letter they wrote to the pastors was read from a number of pulpits.
Right.
I believe Memorial, Presbyterian, Catholic Church. Primarily the churches closer into the woods, not as much the churches that were into the park and further west. And so I would say the Catholic churches were right there with the Protestant churches on this.
Yeah, I agree with that. In my book, there's a summary of what different churches did. I'm not going to read them all. Sacred Heart had an enrichment program that they actually began in July of '66, in which inner city children were bused into the facilities of the convent, and they had an interchange with the students of Sacred Heart who helped them learn and so on. Lady Star of the Sea sponsored a 6-session project commitment in their area. About 400 church members attended meetings in which specialists on the race problem spoke. I mean, there were all sorts of these things going on, and I tried to be very specific in my book. I don't want to get too long-winded.
And if Kathy, people want to know the rest, they need to buy your book or go on Kindle and pay $10 to listen to it. Very good.
I don't know what else to do.
By the way, Peter Palin mentions the public schools served as a great Americanizer. That's for sure. They've certainly integrated. back over to the Q&A. Here's Jacob Nienhaus. My wife and I rented our home on Lake Point to Bill Tucker, and I'd be happy to tell you the story. So maybe I've given everyone Doug and Kathy's email addresses. Maybe you'd like to share that with them. He also helped another couple buy a house at Grosse Pointe Park while he was a member of the open housing group. Actually, the Thomas family, Ed and Jane. Let's go back over, and I've got, I don't know if I've got other questions, maybe not. Nope, I think I've covered everything then. Any other questions, please put them up now. Doug, Kathy, let me mention one other thing, especially for the students that are here tonight or will be watching at a later date. Dr. King finished his speech at Cobo Center, now TCF Center, our convention center on the river, in June of '63, and then his great Washington speech, the March on Washington 2 months later on August 28th, 1963, was something that really hits home tonight when he talks again about Negroes being able to buy or rent a house anywhere that their money can carry them. And when this happens, we will allow freedom's ring. We will let it ring from every village and every hamlet, from every state and every city. We'll be able to speed up to that day when all of God's children, black and white men, Jews and Gentiles, Protestants and Catholics, will be able to join hands and sing the words of the old Negro spiritual, free at last, free at last. Thank God Almighty, free at last. Great. Anything else, Doug, Kathy?
No, thank you.
Gosh, thank you so much. What a wonderful evening. I hope I've answered all the questions. I believe I have. Yep, I think I have one. Let's make sure. Oh, do we have any current data about how POC view of the Grosse Pointe, how the Grosse Pointe community is viewed today? I don't know that, to be fair to Kathy, she's been in Houston for 40 years, and Doug's been traveling the world as a minister and then in the Navy as a chaplain for all of this time. I'm not certain that we do. I mean, I read the Grosse Pointe News every week and the Free Press every Sunday, and then look at it online during the week. But I'm not anybody.
Every 10 years or so, people from newspapers or from the community have called me up and they asked me, you know, do you know what's going on now? And I really haven't been able to answer that. Some of my friends have told me at class reunions different things about the schools and difficulties in the schools and things like that. But other than that, I think
Great.
everything.
Do you remember, either one of you remember who the mayor of Grosse Pointe Park was at that time in the mid '60s?
No, but the
You know, Kathy's got it in her book. Doug, I thought you might have it in your book, of course.
The
Yeah.
mayor of Grosse Pointe Farms I have in my book.
Okay, but not the park. We could certainly look it up. As a matter of fact, you could go to the Grosse Pointe Park website and find it there. Well, anyway, it is 8:58. We plan to finish by 9. So as long as Doug and Kathy have nothing more, Kathy, want to please let me know the next time you're going to be in the area. And Doug, we'll look forward to seeing you Saturday. You know, it is a book signing, but if people have questions for Doug, would like to meet him in person, please feel free to come. 12 noon until 2 p.m. at the circa or the 1823 Grosse Pointe Historical Society Provençal Warehouse House Museum. And we hope you can join us then. We also hope you can join us for the May lecture about the Grand Estates of Grosse Pointe. And a decision was recently made. The new buildings at the Ford House will not be opening until Memorial Day weekend. So unfortunately, that program will once again be online as tonight was. Thank you all so much. What an incredible, amazing talk. And I really appreciate your time, Kathy and Doug. And Adam, is there anything we need to say before we sign off?
I don't think so.
Okay, good. Tonight's program will be up online in the next week or so, and we look forward to the book signing. And there is on the screen now the address for the YouTube channel. I'm sorry, is that it, Adam? That's the lecture.
Yep, that's our YouTube channel. So you can get all of our lectures from this past year, but also previous year's lectures. So we're hoping to have all of the lectures from at least the past decade uploaded within the next few months.
Great. I apologize. I had the chat up on the screen, couldn't read that. So again, thank you all very much for attending. Hopefully you can join us in May and have a good evening. Take care.